Welcome to the Balance Sheet, where you rise above the noise and learn about the most important issues of our age. I'm your host and fellow student, Conrad Chua. 2024 was a super cycle year for democratic elections, and polling was everywhere in news broadcasts, campaigns, debates. But how much do we really understand about how polling works? Why do some polls get it right while others miss the mark? Now, if you were up late at night on the 4th of July watching the UK general election results come in, you would have seen our guest today analyzing all the poll data. Sir John Curtice is Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and has been breaking down complex data in a way we can all understand. Today, he'll pull back the curtain on polling. So John, welcome to the live stream.
It's great to be with you, Conrad.
So, John, polling is sometimes seen as this black box by the public. Can you walk us through what goes into a high quality poll?
Yes, well, of course, the first thing to realize is that how polling is done has evolved over time. So if we just very briefly go back to the days when I first got involved in this, which is now going back more years than I care to remember, we're back to the day before, one, the internet, and two, universal telephone access. And by that, I mean universal landline telephone access. This is before the days of the mobile phone, okay? Then how was polling done? It was essentially done by interviewers knocking on people's doors. It was usually done by what's known as quota sampling. That is basically they were told to find so many people aged, let us say 45 to 64, so many men, so many women, so many people in working class jobs, etc., etc. But beyond that, the interviewer was left to their own devices. So even then, it was not strictly speaking random sampling, because basically opinion polls have to be done within a reasonably short period of time. That's one of their potential limitations, because otherwise the information is too out of date for the news organizations. So that's kind of going back to, as it were, pretty much, polling of going all the way back to the 1950s, when it really begins to become relatively ubiquitous. The two developments of one, universal phone access, followed by the extension then into near universal mobile access. But secondly, the advent of the internet has dramatically changed the way in which polling is done. Most polling in the UK and now also in the US and many other countries is done over the internet. Now, even then, there are a variety of ways of doing it. There are certainly two big differences. Well, perhaps three. One is that quite a few companies, YouGov, for example, in the UK, they maintain their own panel of potential respondents to an individual internet poll. So YouGov are always trying to recruit people into this panel. They will run adverts on various sites, including on, sites that have nothing to do with politics, because one of the challenges for pollsters is to get hold of people who are not terribly interested in politics. And if you then are attracted by one of these offers, and usually there's a financial incentive, you are then asked when you sign up, well, how did you vote in the last election? How old are you? What's your age? Lots of things about your background, which therefore means that when YouGov are trying to do a panel, given that for the most part we've got pretty good information about the characteristics of the population demographically and in terms of how people voted last time, they can issue a set of invitations where the people who are being invited to participate are known to be representative of the characteristics of the general population, or indeed in some instances, insofar as some groups are less likely to respond, you may deliberately oversample some groups. That's one way. Now, that said, there are other organizations which don't have the resources to do that, but there is now within, it's not just polling, it's used by people who do market research or etc., quite a lot of companies who are doing market or political research actually simply buy in a sample by so-called panel providers. There are now companies that create their own panels, who they then, again, try to recruit people into them, who they then sell samples on to polling organizations. Arguably a little bit less high quality because you have less control over what you get. There are then some organizations who may mix that way of getting hold of people, neither of which is random sampling of the kind that you would like to have according to statistical theory, but we've never really had, may mix that with so-called river sampling. And this is where you might advertise the fact that a poll is being conducted on a number of websites that, again, may have nothing to do with politics, okay? And again, you're trying to say to people, would you like to take part in this poll? And again, you have to get them to give you characteristics about themselves. But it means you're, in some senses, picking them up at random from an invite. Now, there are other ways of doing it. There is one company in the UK that, and this is something that's been done by other very high quality end organizations, but not necessarily ones that go into political polling, where if you are running surveys where you originally recruit people through random sampling. Now, in these days, that might still be over the internet. You might simply send people, if you've got a population register, you can use which is accessible, you can use the population register. We don't have one in the UK, but we have the post office runs a so-called postcode address file, which, like Canada, is very, very detailed. So from which basically you can send out invitations to participate in a survey to a random sample of addresses, get a random sample of respondents from that, and then from that random sample, you can say, look, are you willing to do other surveys? And one company in the UK, Varian, used to be Kantar, actually used that technique to do polling over the internet, but to what was at least originally a randomly recruited sample. There is still, both in the US and in the UK, some people who do it by phone. There's only one company left, well, two, who perhaps do it by phone. In some cases, they're literally engaging in random digit dialing. But of course, access to the phone, because landlines are now no longer ubiquitous, and getting hold of people over the mobile can be quite difficult. That's has its challenges. Or again, you may actually, in some instances, you may recruit people off previous surveys, again, where you've got information about their characteristics. Nobody these days, I think, does it face to face. There are a variety of ways of collecting a sample. If it's done over the internet, basically you are giving people, again, lots of people answer via mobile or via a laptop. You will give them, you will invite them basically to log on to the survey and take part in it. Or, of course, if it's being done over the phone, you're basically ringing people at random and hoping that they're willing to answer your questions, give you 5-10 minutes or so of your time, and that they're not in the middle of cooking or putting the baby to bed or whatever. Roughly the world.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I can tell you that if I get a phone call from somebody, a polling company, I would never pick it up. I think it's a scam call.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's obviously one of the challenges. Yeah, the response rates to all, even high quality person-to-person surveys, which are still done these days, a 40% response rate now is regarded as good. Again, if I go back 40 years, you would regard 70% as the minimum. The response rates to random telephone, 10%. Response rates to random internet, if you have a long field work period, you might get it up to about 15 to 20%, but wow. That's it. But the truth is, these days, high response rates are difficult to get however you do it, though fortunately, the research evidence so far is that low response rates are not necessarily correlated with bias, or at least not necessarily correlated with bias so long as you engage in a fair amount of weighting.
Hmm. Well, well, John, I'm going to bring you back almost 70 years then.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the very famous times when polls were completely wrong. And
Yes.
I think this was the 1948 US presidential election. This is the Chicago Daily Tribune, which famously had a very early print deadline in those days. So they decided well, Dewey was going to beat Truman. And in this picture, Truman obviously very happy to show that he actually had won. Um, was this the case where there was that lack of representative sampling that got people wrong, misled?
Yes, because basically the poll that was being quoted was being done amongst readers of the Reader's Digest, which were disproportionately Republican. And the crucial lesson for that is George Gallup, who founded the Gallup organization, and who had already started polling just before the Second World War and did some thereafter. It was his insistence that basically you needed to come up with high quality samples. And in those, I mean, for Gallup, in those days, random sampling was what ideally they would did. It's something that has been embraced and was retained in the United States in particular much longer than it was inside the UK. But certainly sampling is absolutely crucial. And the truth is that although there are lots of other theories that are often put forward when the polls do get it wrong, and they still sometimes get it wrong. They got it wrong to a degree in Britain in July, although the polls in the States in November were much better than people realize. But when they do get it wrong, I mean, journalists' favorite explanation is always people lied, or people who support a particular party weren't willing to answer the polls. So, for example, therefore, people were saying Trump supporters weren't willing to talk to left-wing sociologists who run the polls, etc. We've had similar such supposed explanations inside the UK. In practice, what you usually discover is the problem is a sampling one. The problem is that you've ended up with a sample which is unrepresentative and which you have not managed to overcome through. And again, this is a crucial part of the game. Of course, the results that get reported by opinion polls are not simply the numbers of people who said X, Y, and Z. They are the numbers after the pollsters have tried perhaps to weight the data so that the people who have responded are demographically and politically representative, although that's a bit of an art. You may also be trying to take into account the fact that some people may be more likely to vote than others in a poll. You may ask people how likely you are to vote. There are various ways of trying to do that. So you may therefore filter some people out of your poll on the grounds they're not going to vote. But those techniques may still not succeed in removing what may be an original bias in your sample. And lo and behold, therefore, you can end up with a problem.
I've never participated in a poll before, never selected for whatever reason. What goes on in that polling, those questions, after they go through all those demographic questions to figure out, your gender, where you live, etc. Do they just simply ask you who would you vote for?
Well, again, it's not necessarily everybody the same. If we're talking about doing a general election, well, let's say just at any time, fairly standard question is, if there were a general election tomorrow, for which party would you vote? You might elaborate that depending on the country and say, would you vote Democrat, Republican, or what? Or for the CDU, SPD, AFD, whatever, right? I mean, you may name some of the principal parties that vary from country to country and time to time. You might then, this then will vary within countries. You might then go, if I then say, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure, you might follow up and say, well, look, which party do you think you are most likely to vote for? And you might want to count those in with the people who give you a proportion initially. Almost undoubtedly, also, you will be asked how likely you are to vote, maybe on a scale from 0 to 10, and say, well, how likely do you think you are to vote? You may also get asked about whether you voted the last election or whether you normally vote or whatever, again, to try and get further evidence as to who is going to vote and who is not going to vote, so that pollsters know how much weight to place on the answers that you have given. Beyond that, then it depends very much on the purpose of the poll. If you're talking about, sometimes that's all that polls do. What other polls will do is they will be trying to, in part, they may be trying to satisfy the news agenda of a commissioning organisation. There, the human interest aspect of politics often dominates. How well do you think Donald Trump is doing a good or bad job as president? How good or bad a job do you think Kamala Harris would have done if she had managed to win the election? How well do you think that Madame Le Pen would be if she were president of France? How well do you think President Macron is doing? So you get do you think favorably or unfavorably about Schultz, Merz, etc., etc. You will get polling about the individuals. You may also quite often, we can debate there, but how well do you think the Conservative Party would handle immigration or the economy, etc. What you tend to get less of, rather surprisingly, is actually asking people, what do you think the government should do? You tend to get very little to say, whether or not you support, tightening up the rules on immigration, or increasing taxes, or spending more on the health service. You may get some, particularly if an issue is strong in the domain, but a lot of polling is really about things that are easily reported, like voters say that the economy is the most important issue. Party X is ahead on this issue. This is the reason why Party X is ahead in the polls. Okay, it's fairly banal. Academic research would be much more about trying to establish what voters thought about the issues, and then to see to what extent these are correlated with how people vote, and you establish importance in that way. But opinion polls don't have time to do that kind of thing.
I'm surprised you say that polls don't really ask people what should the government do, because I was under the impression that at least there was this thing during the Blair government and even after that, where governments were almost driven by polls. Some governments tend to be driven by the polls, and they do loads of focus groups, try to figure out what people want, etc. So do parties use their own polls to shape policies?
Yes. Well, parties, I'll give you two answers. One is that parties certainly do their own private polling, sometimes to test messages. The polling might be quantitative, it might be qualitative, particularly if they're trying to find, not necessarily to find out what they should do, but rather how they should message it, how they should send it, how they should persuade people of what they would do anyway. But I have to say to you, Conrad, my back is scarred with the comments of politicians who are not willing to believe the evidence of polls and surveys. For example, again, going back, you might think that Tony Blair was driven by polls. Oh no, Tony Blair was very much driven by a set of preconceptions. And I well remember during the run-up to the 1997 election, and indeed immediately afterwards, when the Labour Party under Tony Blair won their first general election, and we were, British Social Attitudes, which is a very high quality annual survey, it's not really polling, was constantly saying, you know what, if you ask people whether or not they want taxes cut or spending to go up. They want spending to go up because they're more concerned about the state of the public services than they are about the level of taxation. Labour, who had interpreted the reason why they lost the election in 1992 is because they said they were going to increase taxes, said, we do not believe you. People are lying. They're giving a socially acceptable answer. People are, we cannot possibly afford to say to people that taxes will go up. Well, eventually, 2 years into office, the penny dropped because MPs who in the UK hold constituency surgeries were getting loads and loads of complaints from their constituents about, I cannot get a hospital appointment. This is terrible. And eventually, 2 years into office, the penny dropped, Labour turned on the spending taps, and indeed in the end increased taxes. But they did not believe the surveys. It was only when they got their own MPs got the message from their own constituents that they changed tack. The point was Labour were determined to believe what they needed to do to win the election. Oh, by the way, not dissimilar to Labour in 2024 either, but that's another whole story, right? Politicians at the end of the day will use polling not necessarily to change their minds as to work out either how the government, the people are reacting to what they already have done, or to try to work out how to persuade them of the merits of what they propose to do or have done. It's much more about selling than it is about determining what you do. Though, sure, sometimes the feedback mechanism will work.
Mm-hmm. We had the master of Selwyn College on the show before, and he worked in the BBC for 20 over years.
Sure.
And he talked about how the news broadcast, well, he was talking about how people like the BBC didn't get the reporting correct in the lead up to Brexit. But he said that actually it was the local channels that could see where the tide was turning. So I was just thinking when you said it was the MPs in the local constituencies who felt the pulse. Is that the kind of qualitative feeling of the pulse that's more accurate sometimes than a very aggregated polling?
The problem is, of course, Conrad, is that like all human beings, MPs do hear and view what they hear and see through a partisan lens. So how many times do you hear politicians say, a journalist will say to somebody, well, look, poll X says that, people want more money spent on the health service. And the reply will come back to politics, that's not what we're hearing on the doorsteps. What I'm hearing on the doorsteps is that people think that too much money has been wasted on the health service. And it's basically, we need to make sure we make the health service more efficient. Now, that will be the response of a politician who believes that that is what we should do, okay? So politicians can be quite selective in the listening. I mean, the example I quoted to you is where at the end of the day, Labour MPs at the end of the day, many of them will be not unsympathetic to actually spending more, right? Okay. So they, in that instance, they hear the message. But if politicians hear a message they do not like, for a long time, they're very good at filtering it out. So, in those circumstances, the polls can be reliable. I mean, I'll give you again one very particularly British example. My analysis of the predicament of the previous Conservative government, which lost very, very heavily in July, it spent a lot of time in the run-up to the election doing two things. One is it kept on trying to reduce taxes, and secondly, it tried to curb immigration. And some of us said, well, actually, if you analyze the polling data, people aren't very interested in tax cuts because they're more concerned about the state of the health service. Oh, and by the way, yes, people aren't very happy about the level of immigration, but actually there's very little relationship between people's willingness to vote Conservative again and what they think is happening to immigration, right? So immigration is not the thing that's pushing your vote down. It's the health service, and it's the state of the economy. But you could not persuade the Conservative Party even if you wanted to, and I wasn't particularly trying to do so, but the point was we did discover, as the polling evidence would have told them if they had looked at it sensibly enough, that actually the two tax cuts that government implemented did not change their position in the polls. And the more they talked about immigration, the worse their poll position got. Okay, because the point was their belief was, the mistake we have made as a government is to increase taxes. We have to go back to doing what we promised we would do. We said we would reduce immigration. We've now got to go back and tell people we reduce immigration. Of course, if you thought about it, it was a very difficult sell. Vote for us on the basis not what we've done in the last 5 years, but what we promised to do in the next 5 years, which would be the complete opposite of what we've done in the last 5 years. A very, very difficult sell. I mean, any marketeer could tell you that. But that because ideologically they were in favor of lower taxation and lower immigration, they weren't willing to change their position.
So I'll ask you as a political scientist then, do you see that people's attitudes towards voting, whether one party or another, has there been a big shift? Or is it because we see this sort of volatile political environment, huge swings one way to the other? Is the electorate actually like that, where they're undecided until the day before the election? Everything is so complex, they're trying to balance all these different factors in their mind until just as they enter that polling booth.
Well, some voters are undecided, but many also will be fairly stable. I mean, I think I would address your question in two ways. I think the instability to be aware of is perhaps a rather more deep-seated one. I mean, the first thing I would point out is that in most of the so-called mature democracies of Western Europe, so the Netherlands, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, the parties that are now significant players in their respective parliaments are in all cases notably different from what was the case 20 or 30 years ago. All of these countries have seen substantial changes in their party systems, not least the rise of the populist right, but not exclusively that. We've seen, PASOK in Greece being overtaken by much of his vote being taken by Syriza, which is a kind of populist party on the left. There is, it's not short-term instability. It's kind of once upon a time, back in the early 1960s, there was a very famous academic article that basically argued that party systems in Western Europe were basically frozen. They were frozen in the aspect created by the industrial revolution and the class divide that created. Okay. What, however, has been happening more recently is that basically our politics in most countries is no longer simply a debate about how big or small the state should be and how equal or unequal society should be, which is the kind of classic debate between the left and the right. It's now also about what is sometimes called cultural issues, or about woke and anti-woke, or more deep-seatedly, it's essentially about some of the consequences of globalization. Globalization has produced labor markets in a lot of advanced industrial societies where essentially, everybody, majority of society is now are in middle-class jobs, often relatively high-skilled jobs. But to acquire those jobs, you therefore need to be educationally highly qualified. And the days of when you can rise through a career through essentially leaving school at 16 and gradually working your way up through a company or whatever, those days are largely over. So therefore, we have societies where their labor markets are much more dependent on labor market credentials, which therefore creates a division between those who are doing well out of our globalized economy and those who are not. And secondly, of course, it's creating migratory flows, which again, some people are quite happy with. They tend to be the same people who do well out of a globalized world, and others do not. And of course, also globalization has now also rather, since the financial crisis, also become something of an economic challenge as well. Okay, you put all that together, and so therefore we've now got these debates about the cultural challenges of immigration and about some other issues. In the UK, we've had a particular take on this, which is about the role of the European Union and the fact that we've got out of it. So we now have a second dimension of politics, which is essentially about whether you are a social liberal or a social conservative. Okay, and a lot of the populist right is focusing on issues of social conservatism rather than necessarily, strictly speaking, right as in the conventional traditional sense. And again, you see this in Donald Trump. Now, in some countries like the United States and in the UK in 2019, that divide got organized within the conventional party system. But in the UK in 2024, it may well have broken apart, and lots of other West European countries. The fact that politics, in some cases, wasn't necessarily unidimensional in the first place, but has now become more multidimensional, has helped to ensure that electorates are being pulled in different directions because the structure of politics has become more complicated. So I think that's how I'd address your question. It's not, yes, in many countries, fewer people have a strong strong sense of attachment to a political party, but there's also a much more structural thing going on, which means that party politics is potentially more multidimensional and therefore, in that sense, also potentially more volatile.
Of course, volatility makes for great news copy and headlines or clickbaits. And a lot of these polls are run by news agencies who want to, or news outlets who want more readers, more people clicking. What would you advise us when we look at a poll, right? To think, what are the questions that we as readers should be thinking about when we look at the results of a poll to see actually what is going on? Is this actually really telling us something?
Okay, well, this is where countries will differ in the extent to which you can do this. But one of the things that is true about the UK, and it's now also true of Australia, but it is not true of the United States, although some companies in the United States do put up some of this information. But both now in the UK and in Australia, if a company that is part of the self-regulatory organisation, there's very little legal regulation in the UK, but there's a self-regulation by the polling companies. They self-regulate themselves that basically, if they do a poll that comes into the public domain, they have to make available over the internet, details of question wording. That's crucial. But secondly, also details of the character of their samples, both weighted and unweighted, how they've weighted the data, and also some pretty basic demographic breakdowns of, who is saying what. Now, anybody who does any kind of survey work will say to you, there was a poll in the UK that got a lot of publicity recently, and in the end, we really discovered it wasn't actually a poll at all. But it was saying that over half of young people think that we're better off if we didn't have democracy and we had an authoritarian leader. Well, the first thing you ask if you hear that deadline is, hang on, who did this poll? And in the end, we discovered it wasn't anybody who was particularly kosher. And B, what questions did they ask? Because once you start asking people about their attitudes towards policy, the answers you get will depend in part on how you frame the issue. You can frame questions using language that potentially might frame it in a positive light, and you might frame it in a negative light. What most survey researchers are trying to do, if they're doing these things seriously, is to ask more than one question, frame it differently, and therefore you actually get a good understanding of where the public stands. But first of all, what question was asked? That's the first thing to ask. Secondly, who did they interview? How did they get hold of their sample? And I refer you back to the beginning of this conversation. what does the sample look like? And the fact that in the UK and in Australia, and for some polling in the US and in other countries, this information is available on the web means you've got 5 minutes, you could go away and take a look. And then you can decide for yourself whether you believe this or not. And of course, if you do this regularly, then you'll have some understanding of how it's done, whether or not this is always not similar. Does this sample look similar to other polls, or does it look rather unusual, etc., etc.? And then you can start doing your own evaluation of what's going wrong. And then actually this information means you can also begin to do a pretty good post-mortem of why the polls got it wrong when they do get it wrong as well.
Oh, you just reminded me of that classic Yes Prime Minister episode on questions for and against national service. And depending on the questions, depending on the order of question, you get vastly different results.
Sure, absolutely. No, of course.
A lot of these polls now say it's within a margin of error.
Yes.
So what does that actually mean, margin of error?
Okay, so in statistical theory, if you undertake a random sample, require a random sample, and the central estimate that you've come up with is somewhere reasonably close to 50%, then sampling theory would say that 95% of the time, your central estimate is going to be within 3 points either way of the correct result, or strictly speaking, the correct result is 3 points either way of where you're at. But there's still a 5% chance that you may be out by more than that. Okay, so that's where the margin of error concept comes from, or confidence interval. Now, as I've already said, most polling isn't random sampling, and the extent to which one can apply this rule of thumb to polls not done that way is debatable. Actually, in the UK, what is now done for those polls who are self-regulated is that basically we've looked at the historical record of the polls and worked out the 95% range, not based on statistical theory, but based on the record over time. So what is the range of results within which the polls historically over the last 10 elections have been 95% accurate? And the answer is basically plus or minus 4%. So there's a slightly wider range, but it's still very much a rule of thumb. And in a sense, as with all these things, if you've got a poll, at the moment inside the UK, we've got a lot of polls that are saying each of three parties are pretty close to 25%. And poll A, party A is up by 1 point and party B is down by 1 point. Basically, that means we do not know who's ahead and nothing has changed. Because once you take into account the margin, all this can simply be the result of the fact that even the best conducted poll, if you do the same organization does the same poll at the same point in time, it will get slightly different results simply as a result of sampling variation, because you're just taking a sample of the population. Yes, sampling theory suggests that 9 times out of 10 you will get it reasonably right, but there will still be variation, so therefore small differences should be ignored.
We have a question.
So always ignore small differences.
Yeah. Unfortunately, small differences don't make for good news copy. But we have a question from Martin in Toronto who asks, will AI help polling?
Maybe. So there's one way in which it definitely can help, which comes back to the question of what question should I ask. The point is, if you take a generative AI and put into it, the kinds of survey and polling questions that have been asked in the past, you can very rapidly get an idea of how a subject's been framed in the past, look at the results that they've come up and get an idea as to how the framing of a question could make a difference to the answer. So that's one answer where it will definitely be helpful. More problematic is, of course, one of the debates that's been going on for quite a while is to what extent can you use information that you gather from social media as a way of getting an indication of the public mood? And of course, if you've got generative AI, if you take that and shove it into AI, then you can. Now, there was a company that was before the US election in November, did a backwards exercise. It took data from previous elections and used generative AI and used that to try and estimate what you would have said the outcome would be, and was suggesting that the result was not that bad. I have to admit I've not followed this up, but equally I've not seen anybody follow it up. They were supposedly also doing this for the Trump-Harris contest, but I've not, shall we say, I've not seen any headlines in which this company said they did it brilliantly, they did better than the pollsters, they knew that Trump was going to win. So I assume they weren't at least any better, but that's simply an assumption on my part. Because of course the question is, how representative is the information you get on social media? Social media, I mean, one of the ways in which some people have used social media is not to analyze levels of support, but to try to pick up changes in support. So if a party if there's a really big event, like a financial market crash, and is this going to affect the popularity of the government? Some people suggest that you can use social media not to measure how popular the government is, but whether or not the people are blaming the government for what is happening. And you can get there a bit more quickly than the polls are. And you can use generative AI for that. But whether or not generative AI is going to, given that we know that people who talk about politics on social media are very heavily disproportionately interested in politics. And if some of the force of some of your questions has been, well, actually, maybe what matters is the people who are not interested in politics and how, in the end, whether they're going to vote and how they're going to vote, how far this will necessarily prove to be helpful or to prove to be better than asking people themselves. In other words, at the end of the day, how human beings are going to behave as opposed to how they behave might still be something where the human brain is a wee bit ahead of generative AI, because generative AI is, in the end, it's dependent on what human beings have done in the past. And as all you guys in the markets know, the past performance is not necessarily a guide to future behavior.
As someone who has to deal with students who tell me one thing but then do something completely different when it comes to class selection or career outcomes, I completely understand what you mean about the kind of hidden preferences and revealed preferences. Wow. So thank you so much, John, for giving us this wonderful insight into the world of polling, how it works, its impact on elections, and towards the end, where it could possibly be headed in the future. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for your very interesting questions.
And to our viewers, if you found this discussion valuable, don't forget to share it with your network. Let us know your biggest takeaway in the comments. If you want to contact me, the QR code will bring you to my LinkedIn profile, and you can send me a DM. Please put the words balance sheet in the message so that I can read it. And till next time, please stay safe and stay curious. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.